So you must have heard this one a lot. A lot of places I've been to, I hear people saying, uh, showing concern and complaining how there has been a lot of activism in the last few years. Since 2008, the uprising, the protests, non-stop, people getting arrested, self-immolations, and somehow people say nothing has changed. Where are we? We are still stuck here. We haven't made any gains, you know. So I think people have this kind of feeling that we are stuck in the same place and we haven't made any progress.
But that's understandable when there is no apparent change, like China not moving out, exiled Tibetan not coming back, and then there's no apparent freedom. In fact, the situation in Tibet is getting worse. It's becoming much more confrontational. At the same time, if you actually look at the ground reality, daily there is so much of change already happening. And since 2008, Tibetan National Uprising Movement, so much of changes is happening, and so much have already been done by the Tibetans inside Tibet. For example, in the case of education, the whole language rights movement, led by Tibetan students, school students, college from universities, Tibetan intellectuals got involved in it, which later moved into a larger cultural movement. Tibetans reclaiming their culture as their identity, and which is encapsulated in their own language, and therefore whole new awareness that our strength is here in our own culture. So this realization in the Tibetan youngsters is truly, for me, finding of new power, that they now do not have to fear Chinese guns or their promise of money or their the spread of commercialization. They don't have to fear. They now are so very confident. So this finding of new Tibetan identity is, for me, almost kind of a renaissance. And that, because it shaped the Tibetan people's mind and the direction, Chinese are now targeting Tibetan writers, intellectuals, musicians, singers. And then look at the environment. In the field of environment, Tibetans are not only being aware of their own environment rights, but they are protecting their own environment. And Tibetan nomads and farmers, refusing to settle down into these matchbox houses, kind of reservation kind of houses. So they are resisting, reclaiming, and this hugely political awareness and awakening of the Tibetan people, which happens day to day. For Tibetans inside Tibet, daily it is a struggle, daily is a resistance.
Yeah, I think that the saying, the ruler cannot rule if the people do not obey. And this is what it's coming to inside Tibet. And this is not the way it used to be. In fact, I remember in the, say, mid to late 90s, even early 2000s, when we would travel around, give talks, participate in campaigns, people would say to us, many people were feeling very down and saying, if you look in Tibet today, most Tibetans are just keeping their heads down, just trying to survive. China's pouring money in. Every Tibetan in Lhasa has a car or a cell phone, or you're just seeing more and more prosperity, and the movement's dead. And people are too scared even beyond that to do anything. And actually, this loss of fear is the tipping point. The loss of fear that we have seen inside Tibet over the last number of years, and certainly since 2008, I think this sort of signals the end of Chinese control in Tibet. Maybe not practically today, but in the long run. And ultimately, in a way, it's symbolized for me also in the self-immolations. And as much as these are painful for us to watch and tragic, and every Tibetan is sort of torn apart at the loss of life of these Tibetans inside who have given their lives in these self-immolation protests. Ultimately, what those protests say to the Chinese is, you don't control us. You try to, the way that you have controlled and ruled in Tibet through all these years is through fear of violence, through intimidation, through the idea that you will hurt us, we will suffer if we step out of line. And then you have Tibetans who've stepped forward and said, actually, in the most sort of extreme example, stepped forward and said, actually, the fear of violence and the pain and suffering that you put on us won't stop me from being a Tibetan, from speaking this truth, and I actually will take my own life before I will let you, you know, your word be the last word in Tibet. And that is really quite remarkable.
I think the idea of obedience, you know, I think whether it's Gandhi or more recently, you know, analysts and theorists like Gene Sharp, when they look at the dictatorship, what they see or what they saw is, you know, how the best tool of the oppressor is when they can buy people's obedience, right? And like you said, I think we are past the moment now where the Tibetans collectively decided not to give our obedience to the Chinese government. So we are seeing that, right? So I think that in and of itself is almost like a landmark. It's the watershed. And I think in terms of comparison, when I look at the Indian freedom struggle, you know, we on paper and, you know, legally, we use 1947 as the date when India became independent. But in terms of when India truly became independent, when the Indian people decided to be free, that goes back, you know, several years when the Indians started to launch their civil disobedience, you know. And in that sense, I think sometimes I feel like almost the Tibetans are not obeying the Chinese government anymore, and in a way we have got to that stage, right? And also another major change that we have seen is how in the past we used to talk about politics. The political struggle is a weapon to, you know, protect our culture. But in that kind of belief, there is a implied meaning or implied kind of a way of seeing our culture as something that's very fragile and need to be protected all the time, you know. But nowadays, like you were saying, people have decided to actually almost like discovering culture as a, you know, weaponizable kind of commodity or asset, and now we're using our cultural language, poetry, music to actually fight for political rights. And in that sense, I think there's also a huge shift that is taking place.
The loss of fear that Lhadon, you pointed out, for me, it's actually finding the voice of defiance. And that is freedom. Freedom of every individual who have lost fear and who found voice in defiance. And here, loss of fear is not just the loss of fear of their life, but regaining where their power lies. Our power lies in our land. Our power lies in our own culture. Our power lies in seeing the collective interests, seeing the collective belief in our culture, and that creates unity. And therefore, when we have such strength, and it took so many years to come to this level, but we have come to this level where people are no longer fear of the threats. People can no longer be bought by the promise of money. And when you have such kind of a power and the defiance that people in Tibet lead, it is not necessary to see in the street kind of protest every day. And therefore it belies the whole myth that nothing is happening. In fact, so much is happening. And this has actually redefined the whole nature of resistance movement inside Tibet.